One of the things that really shines through is that we have a lot of work to do. When we kind of think about what lies ahead with a sustainable energy future, with a clean technology, the vision that we're trying to fulfill, we are reminded over and over again of the fact that it falls on the shoulders of this community to provide the feedstock materials that will be required to create that clean energy reality. And that is an enormous responsibility. And I think one of the other things that becomes very clear when we think about that is that there's no scenario, no serious scenario whatsoever where we are not innovating and bringing to bear significant new technologies. And when we think about innovating in a very serious way, there's two brands that kind of come to mind front and center from the business news, and those are Google and Amazon. Now, maybe you like them, maybe you hate them. I'll bet you wish you invested in them. But what's very important to realize is that they are very good at the innovation game. And so it is my intention today to kind of pull back the curtain a little bit and to see what can we learn, what can we glean from how those folks at Google and Amazon, what did they do a little bit differently in the innovation domain that we potentially could learn from? I just want to expand a little bit on the background of who I am and where I come from, because I think it's materially relevant to the narrative that I'm about to explain to you here. As she said in the opening remarks, I am a professor at the Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia. I do owe you an explanation about why I don't have the cool accent that goes with Australia. I was born and raised in Canada, and it's been my pleasure to call Australia home for the past 11 years or so. I spent the first half of my career or so with Shell International. So that kind of gave me a front row seat for being a part of the extractive industries and seeing how that works. But then in the latter part of my career, it's been my pleasure to do a lot of work kind of at the intersection of the resources sector plus digital. So working with big mining companies, working with big energy companies that want very much to kind of pull digital things into what they're doing, but also from the other side, what are digital companies doing that they want to kind of get into the energy and resources sector? So I've been able to kind of talk to both communities and try to kind of work together with them on that. And here's what I see. Working with both of those communities, here's what I know. They don't think and talk and act about innovation like we do. They kind of look at it a little bit differently. And it is my intention to crystallize for you into a few points what it is that they do differently. I'm going to invest a couple of minutes trying to impress upon you, because you might be asking yourself at this juncture, who cares what Google and Amazon think? I mean, that is so far removed from the conversations that we have been having in this room over the last couple of days. Why is this man in front of us talking about faraway places and industries that are only marginally in your in-tray in the day-to-day reality of what you do? I'm going to explain that. But I'm also going to try to explain to you what is it that we can learn from them that isn't industry specific. What are the parts that we can kind of say, now there's a really good idea. If we change that a little bit and drag it kicking and screaming to the resources sector, what can they teach us that is useful? And at the end of that, I'm going to give you 6 principles of innovation kind of coming from this crucible of Silicon Valley, from the Googles and the Amazons of the world, that I believe that we can transplant successfully to the resources and energy sector. Now, what I've just said might bring about an autoimmune response on the part of some of the audience here. Some of you might be saying, is this guy saying to us that we have not been good at innovating, that we have not been spending millions or indeed billions of dollars on this stuff? No, he is not. It has been my pleasure to be a part of that journey during my years with Shell. I can confirm firsthand that these industries and these people have done a tremendous amount of work in the resource sector in applying all manners of technology, some of them digital, some of them less so. We have been working very hard to introduce the Internet of Things, digital twins, introducing smartness. All of these things have happened in other sectors and have been successfully extended to the resources and energy sector also. And in so doing, we have delivered significant operational efficiencies and cost savings. But it's not getting the job done fast enough. If we kind of look at the big picture of what we're trying to achieve, the truth of the matter is that our overall greenhouse gas emissions have not been going down. In fact, they have been going in exactly the wrong direction. And this energy transition that we have been speaking about so passionately over the last few days, the truth of the matter is that the numbers aren't quite where we want them to be. The fraction of overall energy that is being created in the global economy that we can attribute directly to renewable energy is that orange line you see kind of just bumping off the bottom there, still sub 10%. We are not where we need to be. And again, to reiterate why this matters is the people, the industries, and the organizations represented in this room, in this community, these are the feedstock materials that the rest of the world is counting on us to deliver so that the green energy revolution can happen. If we don't do our part of that, the story kind of stops right there. Let me give you a few data points just to kind of drive that home. And I know that I'm kind of preaching to the choir. I know that what I'm about to say in the next few slides, this is probably well known to most of you, but I synthesize it here just to make sure that we're kind of on the same, the logical flow of the whole thing. An offshore wind project uses about 9 times the amount of minerals and mined products that a natural gas-fired power plant of the same generating capacity would use. So on one hand, fantastic. So we're disabusing ourselves of fossil fuels and we're kind of discovering religion and we're kind of moving to that, zero carbon future, but we have to mine so much stuff to get to that promised land. Let's talk about copper. If we're going to get to the church on time with our Paris Agreement commitments, we're going to have to mine by the year 2050 an amount of copper that is more than what we have created in all of human history until today. That is what is required of us. Here are some figures from the International Energy Agency. You'll see that copper is the third metal out of 4 on this figure. What I want to draw your attention to here is that alarming statistic I just said about the copper. Copper is actually among the lowest hanging fruit when we're talking about these minerals that we're going to need to turn this corner, to make the energy transition happen. To deliver on the promise of green and clean tech energy, we're going to have to somewhere between 2x and 3x the amount of copper. That is to say, we're going to have to make 2 or 3 times more than we have only a few years ago. So copper is kind of the easiest part. If we look at rare earth elements, we're going to have to 4x to almost 7x that. And the numbers even just get more alarming from there. Lithium, somewhere between a 12x to, in the worst case scenario, maybe a 40x. Cobalt, maybe a 20x. Nickel, also a 20x. So here's my point. It's time for X. We have been very pleased with ourselves for a very long time. We should rightly be proud of the fact that we have made huge gains and we've increased things by 15% here or 20% over here in terms of our productivity and our efficiency. The time for us to be sanguine about 15% gains, that time has passed. It is now time for us to insist among ourselves that we start reaching for X. We need to start thinking in terms of the material requirements that the rest of the marketplace is demanding from us. We need to step up and deliver the 10x, the 20x. It's the foundation for the transition that they're depending on. So if we want to find inspiration and ask the question, well, who can tell us? Who's built a playbook, written the playbook on how do we do a 10X? What does that look like? Because we don't have a lot of that in our DNA. Well, there are industries that have done that successfully. Let's look at them and see what they can tell us. Now, when we kind of look to the semiconductor industry, this figure here, if you're a propeller head guy like myself, engineers probably recognize Moore's law here. Gordon Moore, one of the founding fathers of the Intel Corporation, unfortunately, he passed away only a few weeks ago. He made the casual observation almost 50 years ago that the density of transistors that we could squeeze into an integrated circuit, that density was approximately doubling every 18 months to 2 years. And that trend continued unabated since the 1970s. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that this is what obsession looks like. I can think of few, if any, physical parameters, any technical specs that we have in the resource and energy sector that behave like this. We don't double very much, very often, and they're doing it here every 18 months to 2 years over a 50-year period. That's obsession. That's what we need to start looking like. So I invoked two examples to kind of have that conversation about Silicon Valley and the digital folks. Let's talk about Google for a second. Google, and you know, it's so ubiquitous, it's so common these days that we kind of forget how recent this was. The google.com domain name was registered in 1997. Not that long ago. The first ever Google server looked like this. It was assembled on the Stanford campus with Lego bricks because they couldn't find something in the market that was really the size and shape that they needed. So version 1.0 of their server farm looked like this, Lego bricks. Today, the parent company called Alphabet has a market cap of over $1 trillion. It is the fourth largest company in the world. Only what, 26 years later. What does Google do to make money? About 80% of the revenues come from advertisements. The Google search engine, it's so commonplace that we've literally verbified it. We, you know, much like we use the word Kleenex in America or you know, Hoover in the UK, it's a brand name that is synonymous with the thing that you do in the market. So when you want to find something in the internet, we Google it. And between those advertising revenues and the YouTube ads, that's 80% of how they make their money, but they've expanded that into this broader platform. At the root of it, it's really all about one thing, and that's organizing the world's information and making it universally accessible and useful. I'd also like to point out that Alphabet, the parent company that owns Google, has invested $39.5 billion in research and development last year. That's going to come up again later, and I'll explain in a second. Let's talk about the Amazon origin story. That was started in 1994, only 3 short years prior to the Google story. This is a younger Jeff Bezos selling books out of his garage. He would take all the packages at the end of the day that he needed to take to the US Post Office. He would drive them personally in his car to the post office and make that drop off every day. He's gone from that to the market capitalization for the company now is also north of $1 trillion. It is the 5th largest company in the world. So what's this one? So this is 29 years old. Google's 26, this one's 29 years old. What's their business model? Well, they basically want to be the conduit for selling you absolutely everything in the world that you'll ever need. Now, some of that they want to do directly and some of that they're okay to do indirectly, but they've expanded also to include technologies that are kind of aid and abet that larger objective. Amazon Web Services, they're among the larger vendors of cloud computing, for example, in the world. One of the interesting things about their business model that I think is particularly noteworthy is their day one strategy. They never want to forget in their corporate DNA, they want to constantly act like a startup. They don't want to ever become complacent, like a fat, lazy corporation that behaves like they have hundreds of thousands of employees. They want to act like a startup in a garage, and they never want to lose that character. That's very much something that they feel very strongly. Now, let me remind you of those dates, the chronology of things here. So one of those tech giants was 26 years old. The other one was 29 years old. I offer this for your consideration. Those mines that we talked about, using the current playbook of how we develop mines, a new mine from the point where a geologist points to the ground and says, let's dig here, until you're actually producing, that process can take upwards of 20 years, sometimes even longer. That's almost how long it takes to make a Google, almost as long as it takes to make an Amazon. So that kind of puts into focus for us a part of what's going on here. We are a slow moving part of the marketplace. We see that reflected also in historically how we've behaved with regards to innovation. What you see on this figure here is basically a stacked bar graph that shows us how long does it take between when a new idea is a twinkle in a scientist's eye until you have 50% market penetration for that new idea. And when we look at this data happens to be from the upstream oil and gas industry, but the mining sector almost certainly resembles this, if not even slower than this, by their own admission. And what we see here is that a whole career can go by between when you have that humdinger idea and when you have a 50% market penetration. Your whole career can go by. So if you have that great idea on day one as a paper hat trainee, you'll be getting your gold watch at retirement just as the thing's starting to take off. That is the time scales that we're talking about. Even when we pat ourselves in the back and say that we have a quote unquote overnight wonder, when we think we've found an example of the industry behaving in a way that is different from that, we are usually wrong. This is the title of a piece written by D.D. Hinton, an American historian. What she's poking fun at here, tongue in cheek, is she's saying that even on our best day, when the world thinks that we have achieved something that resembles an overnight wonder, it took us 17 years. If we are honest with ourselves and look at the facts. So I characterize us in the following way. We all remember growing up with that story. Your mom probably read it, maybe your dad read it, to you basically about the tortoise and the hare, and they had that race. Let us be honest about what side of that we are on. We're the tortoise in this metaphor. Google and Amazon are the hare. Very, very different timescales. Again, I know I'm creating an autoimmune response in the room. Half of you are seething right now and you want to jump up and say, this idiot cannot possibly trying to make a direct comparison between Google and Amazon and the resource sector that is somewhere between disingenuous and ridiculous. He needs to stop immediately. I want you to understand that I do understand these important differences. I know, having worked on an oil and gas platform in the North Sea for many years, I know that what we do in the resource sector is frequently dangerous in a way that is just not, it's not what happens in Silicon Valley. When innovations go wrong in the resource and energy sector, people can get seriously hurt. I do understand that. I understand that ours are among the most capital intensive industries on creation. Nothing happens in the mining sector or the energy sector without an investment of at least billions of dollars. That is not for the faint of heart, investment-wise. And we're also plagued by the small matter of that resources tend to be buried where they are. They are where they are. There's not much we can do about that. Our real-world laboratory isn't as cushy and safe as Palo Alto or Seattle. I get all of these things. And yet I submit to you that I think that there are important things that we can learn from these other parts of the marketplace. What Google and Amazon do that is impressive, that is noteworthy, and that we should learn from is that they've learned how to X. They know how to take a business and they know how to say, let's 10X this, let's 15X this, and then they do it. And that is what we need to learn a little bit about. These folks innovate like their lives depend on it. So how do we modify some of what they have done and try to learn a little bit about how do we learn how to X? If we could be completely honest with ourselves, the truth of the matter is that some of the difference comes down to brute force. They simply spend more. When we look at this quantity here, R&D intensity, but basically that's a ratio of what is the R&D spending divided by the revenues for a particular year. Something quickly comes out of the wash. We see that Alphabet, the parent company of Google, has an R&D intensity of 15.1%. And Amazon was a little bit lighter with 11%. We spend in the resource sector significantly less than that. I understand that there are purists in the audience who probably argue that, yes, but it comes down to how the accounting standards and, okay, but we can't hide behind an accounting standard when we're talking about a factor of 30. I think that there's just no denying that they just outspend. This is, you can see in this statistic how important innovation is to them. This is where it really comes out of the wash, I think. So here's those. I'm going to start with the 6 principles that I think that we can take from what Google and Amazon do, that we can change it, modify it, make it ours, and make it work for us. Here's number 1. We got to learn how to democratize innovation. I have some good news and I got some bad news. I'm going to start with the good news. The good news is that someone in your organization, an employee of yours, maybe a subordinate, maybe it's someone who works right directly below you on the org chart. They probably have that big, hairy, audacious idea that could turn things around. That could be your 10x idea. Here's the bad news. They probably don't feel empowered to tell you about it. That historically has kind of been the culture of how we roll in the resources and energy sector. We're very siloed. Did you know that in Google, for example, if you see a problem on the other side of the company and you're like, I know how to solve that, it is in the company's DNA that you are allowed, no, encouraged. You are encouraged to just jump up from your desk, go join that team on the other side of the company, help them sort that problem out as long as required. It's in their culture to have just to kind of jump up and have that impromptu startup kind of perspective on things. I believe that we have become quite ossified and quite siloed in how we approach innovation in the resource and energy sector. I don't see us behaving like this very often. Think about what if you could take, I don't know how big your organization is, maybe it's 50,000 people, maybe it's 100,000 people. What could you achieve with an R&D department of 100,000 people? You unleash this, you're going to find out. Number 2, anchor your innovation processes in data. Don't fly by the seat of your pants. Don't make this about gut feelings. Make this, let the data speak. Let the data tell you what is working and what is not working. Marissa Mayer, formerly of Google, she went on to be the CEO of Yahoo. She used to say that presentations about new products made to the executive team at Google, they better contain plenty of supporting data. They have never stopped feeling, talking, and acting that way. I submit to you that we have set ourselves up enviably to be this. We have spent so many millions of dollars, billions of dollars over the last few decades, so that we are now able to put our finger on the pulse of the patient. We can measure almost every aspect of our operations. Let's use that. We can measure everything. We can collect the data that we need to make everything that we do a little bit different, a living laboratory, a petri dish, an experiment, if you will. Let's get data obsessed. Let's make the decisions that we make about the data. Number 3, let's cultivate a taste for failure and chaos. You might recognize this little picture. It's usually we see it, it's this little button on software. It's the kind of the undo button, right? So Amazon, basically when people come forward with ideas, they basically ask, is this a one-way door situation or a two-way door situation? Most situations are two-way doors. That is, give it a shot, go through the door, and if it completely wipes out, if it goes completely pear-shaped, we back up, no harm, no foul. And we try to learn along the way, what did we do wrong? What did we learn going through this situation? Fail quickly. Have in this culture in your workforce where people are willing to take bold risks and there's no harm or foul if things don't go well. I don't want to shine any kind of disparaging light on Shell specifically, but I can tell you from my years in the trenches in the resource sector that I don't frequently see this behavior. I see us being gun shy and risk averse most of the time. And I think that the logic that we have to start taking on board if we're gonna learn how to X, is that if we're not making any mistakes, you're not taking enough risk. And we're certainly not learning. So most of our situations are going to be two-way doors. If they are, take the leap, take a chance, take a shot. Number 4, create a culture built to build. Are we doing everything that we can to try to create the fertile environment that people need to come together and to create those bright spark moments that makes the big ideas happen? You might have heard an idea called the Allen curve. Allen was a professor at MIT in the 1970s at the Sloan Management School, and he basically he mapped out how ideas flow through an engineering organization. And he kind of showed that what you want to do is kind of create these serendipitous moments where people bump into each other from different disciplines. Because when those different disciplines kind of swap ideas, that's where your beautiful serendipitous moment happens. To put it in an easier term here, where do you put your water coolers? Where do you have random collisions between employees so that people who have really in the normal flow of a working day, they would have no business talking to each other, make them talk to each other. You're going to be amazed by what you get from that. Expose in an institutional way, expose your employees to new ideas, different disciplines that really aren't at all immediately and obviously related to your own sector. Someone's going to have an idea because of something that happened in a whole other sector. You're going to have these intersections and have those serendipitous moments happen. That's how you make magic happen. Google gets this, Amazon gets this. Also, let's not lose sight of how important it is to have working in physical proximity. One of the counterintuitive things that happened in the COVID situation is that Silicon Valley companies were among the most aggressive in dragging people back to the office. Why? Because they know that there's something irreplaceably human about the innovation experience much of the time. It's hard to have that serendipitous bright spark moment on a Zoom call. Much more likely if those people are in the room with you. Google and Amazon get that. Number 5, budget innovation in job descriptions. Are your employees, are the people in your organization so overworked with the regular grind of their in-tray that they have no chance of thinking kind of lateral thoughts? Google has recurringly, sometimes it's on, sometimes it's off, they have a policy of where they allocate 20% of their working week to projects that are basically whatever harebrained idea the employee came up with. Google they don't prescribe, they don't say, here's what you should be working on for your harebrained project. That's up to you, but you have to come up with something. Google reckons, anecdotally, they say that that policy created at least 50 new products, including things like Gmail. And I'll be darned if that's not half of the email addresses that we're sharing personally these days. AdSense and Google News. So this policy worked like gangbusters, giving people the white space to just think differently, think about something different. If you give them that window of opportunity, let their brain go off in a different direction for a little while, they're going to surprise you with what they come up with. Number 6, become the facilitator of innovation between and among other organizations. Again, with the good news, bad news. The good news is at least one of your suppliers has an amazing idea about how to improve what you do. There might be a 10x idea hiding in there. The bad news, like the employee in that earlier example, the bad news is that that supplier probably doesn't feel empowered to tell you about it. Do you have the kind of relationship with your suppliers where they're going to feel comfortable sharing with you bold, audacious, potentially risky ideas? Do you have that relationship with them? If you do, it would be a rare and beautiful thing in the resources sector, because I don't see it very often. This typically is not the kind of relationship that we cultivate in the resource sector. I'm not saying that that's completely true everywhere. I'm saying it's true most of the time for what I have seen in my years in the industry. Are we genuinely and sincerely trying to co-innovate with those companies, or do we leave the contracts in the hands of our contracts and procurement department, and it is then their job to wrestle that nickel, to wrestle that little bit of money, kind of negotiating with our boot firmly on their throat? Is that the tone and tenor of what we're trying to do with our contracts? Or do we do it in kind of a more win-win kind of way, where they want to and feel incentivized to collaborate with us to make big things happen? I'd like to wrap up with the parting idea. I've said this before, when I've talked to this community, and I think that this is even more relevant than ever, and so I bring it up again. I want to remind you of the timeless words of Salim Ismail. He's a compatriot of mine, a fellow Canadian, and he was working in Silicon Valley for quite some time. And he said, once you turn something digital, it hops onto that Moore's law pace of change and accelerates it. That is what is happening to the resource and energy industries. We are becoming increasingly digital in our underpinnings, and as a result, we are going to start moving conspicuously and noticeably faster. And when that happens, we're going to look a lot less different from Silicon Valley than we used to. It is my belief that with that emerging digital truth that we are facing, and some changes, some ideas from other industries like Google, like Amazon, like what I've explained to you here, I am confident that we will be able to be that provider of the foundational elements and the materials that are required for that clean energy transition. Thank you very much.